My eyes opened with difficulty, as if this morning was different from all the others, heavier and more intimate. The warm breath on my neck, tangled sheets, the body next to mine pressed against me. For a few moments, my mind traced that familiar comfort, the soft smell of soap, the gentle warmth nestled against my back. The last thing I remembered before passing out were the low lights of the hallway and the footsteps on the worn carpet. In my head, it could only be her, Carolyn, returning after our last dry conversation, which was much more silence than words. But everything that seemed habitual twisted when I moved to untangle myself, my fingers touching an unfamiliar hand, larger, rougher, too young to belong to the woman I've shared the same rooms with for decades. My heart raced. Panic bit at my mind, firing off every synapse. I sat up in bed, my body tense, and turned slowly. And there, under the same tangled comforter, with half-open eyes, a beard, and an exhausted expression, Trevor, my own son. The grimy ceiling pressed down on me. It wasn't a dream. It wasn't confusion. It was Trevor. My thoughts jumbled, a whirlwind of guilt, shock. What had I done to wake up like this, with him next to me, so close? Silence fell like snow, muffling even the sounds of traffic that always echoed through the window. My body was paralyzed, my mind projecting 1,000 answers, but none of it made sense. The fear I had carried, for years, in fact, of not being seen, of becoming an accessory, now materialized in an improbable and disturbing scenario. I looked at Trevor, who stared back at me, his eyes dark, deep. He looked as lost as I was, not knowing how to orchestrate an explanation. The following hours of that episode would be marked by a mutual and uncomfortable hesitation, but none of it compares to that first explosion of sensations. I remained motionless, trying to find myself within that chaos. I want you to understand what it's like to live in small-town America, in a cramped space between the garage and the house, where nothing happens, but anything can. The smell of oil takes over the rags, the clothes, my own fingers. Routine means waking up early, grabbing the toolbox, dealing with failing engines, fixing tires while thinking about everything I can't fix inside myself. Carolyn moves through the house like a shadow, always present but inaccessible. She crosses rooms with her hair tied up, her eyes hidden behind old glasses. Our conversations are more bureaucratic than sentimental, and for a few weeks now, she's been sleeping in another bed, separated for reasons that were once screamed, now whispered, and almost forgotten. The workshop at the back of the yard is my refuge. Between hammering and the hissing of an old radio, I exist in silence, surrounded by old cars and rusty parts. Time is marked by the ticking of the clock, the comings and goings of loyal customers, and the constant expectation of what could fill this emptiness. And that's where Trevor comes in, a grown son, distant, almost a memory that resurfaces after months away, having taken to the road as a truck driver. His return is a shock, a forced new beginning. He doesn't give me reasons. He just shows up, bringing with him a worn-out bag and eyes that avoid meeting mine. Carolyn doesn't react to his presence either. Life goes on, as if he were just another piece of furniture returned to the room. On this particular morning, after the awkward encounter in the bedroom, no one talks about the reason for that awakening. We just carry on. The smell of old coffee fills the kitchen, the burnt toast marking the mood of the day. Trevor accepts the imposed silence. He seems tired, just like me, and the tension between us hangs in the air, as if any word could trigger a storm. My son is a grown man, with broad shoulders and calloused hands, as lost as I am in his daily search. We're more alike than we care to admit, each exiled within the same house, inhabiting parallel worlds. I often think that the workshop was made to protect me from everything, but I never imagined that it could do nothing against feelings that insist on seeping into every crack of daily life. Trevor doesn't say much about what brought him back. I know about his truck trips, about sleepless nights in cheap motels and changing tires in the rain and snow. He has a habit of waking up early, of avoiding any discussion, always running away from what could hurt, or hurt me. Our first dialogue, after that morning of silent revelations, barely exists. "Coffee?" he asks. "Already made it," I reply without looking him in the eye. The radio hisses in the background, playing old songs that never go out of style in the workshop. Sometimes our communication is limited to broken sentences, bits of memories, old jokes about the local team, about government problems. We try to touch the surface of what it used to mean to be family, but it's as if a chasm has grown between us. And yet, There's this unsettling curiosity. Does he see in me the same emptiness I see in him? Does he, like me, seek to fill the silence with something new, unexpected? The differences are stark. I'm pragmatic, a firm hand and a closed mind. Trevor is restless, lives on the road, hates roots. But when we work together, whether fixing an engine or just picking up a heavy box, there's a strange synchrony there. Our gestures align, as if our loneliness is talking, fumbling for a way to claim company. However, I keep any hint of a deeper closeness to myself. The last thing I want is to break the little bit of normalcy that remained after what happened. Deep down, we're both exiles. Me from my wife, him from the world out there. As the days go by, our living together slowly changes. There's no rush, no urgency. We share simple activities. Repairs on the old Buick's engine, renovating the ramp behind the house, cleaning tools that were forgotten at the bottom of a box. Each action is a veiled attempt to build some kind of bridge. Carolyn remains distant, busy with her own interests, as if nothing unites us besides the shared roof. Lunch becomes a rare event. Trevor cooks badly, invents improvised dishes, mixes condiments like someone challenging monotony. I sit at the table, watch the way he cuts the meat, looks out the window at the field without ever asking for help. We avoid serious conversations. From time to time he tells a joke, the kind that only those who've lived on the road understand. I laugh without wanting to, more out of politeness than joy. But I notice that, little by little, there's something different. The way he looks at me, his concern when he hands me a wrench. The gestures, once mechanical, now carry a different weight. I don't know if it's habit, longing, or something more. At night, we sit to watch TV. We barely exchange words, but he moves closer on the sofa, his feet firm on the carpet, his arms thrown in any old way. The silence isn't so uncomfortable anymore. It's as if the routine is rescuing memories of who we really are. Deep down, there's a desire to stay together, even without knowing how to explain why. Time inside that house is strange. Close, far, almost non-existent. Trevor's presence revives painful memories. His birth, his first steps, his rebellious adolescence, fights over silly things. But none of that is enough to protect me from what hurts inside. The chronic loneliness that follows me. Living separately from Carolyn has become easier than facing the abyss of being a father to someone I no longer recognize. Living with Trevor only makes the doubt grow. Do we really know who we are, or do we just pretend? My fears pulse in the silence. I'm afraid to say what I feel. Afraid of losing the facade of resistance, of exposing the neediness I hide among tools and car parts. I watch Trevor from a distance, sometimes while he washes his face, other times while he gets ready for bed. The tension never completely disappears. The secret of that morning is like a fissure that threatens to explode at any moment. One day, while we were cleaning the yard, Trevor put down the rake, sat on the edge of the newly painted ramp, and drew with his finger in the dust. I wanted to ask about his trips, about what he really thought of it all, but my courage failed. The fear of touching uncomfortable feelings is greater than any curiosity. Carolyn, all this time, remains in her separate world. She doesn't notice the ruptures, or the attempts to sew any closeness together. When we have dinner together, she chews in silence, looks at her plate, says, "Good night," without looking at either of us. Every gesture of hers is a reminder that family doesn't always mean closeness or affection. One night I went to bed earlier, trying to escape my own ghosts. The emptiness seemed bigger. I felt the house breathing strangely, heavy, full of secrets. The obstacles keep growing. Every day, a new barrier. Time, the lack of conversation, fear, longing, everything mixes together and makes living with Trevor a minefield, full of emotional traps. The constant doubt. Should I face the truth or hide until Trevor decides to leave? Deep down, I'm starting to understand that the biggest obstacle is inside me. My desire to be seen, to be wanted, was never satisfied. I was always the man who solves technical problems and fails at what really matters. Nothing prepared me for the kind of desire that visits me now. The desire to break everything, to find meaning with Trevor. The fear of being discovered by Carolyn. The fear of facing my own moral limits. All of it brutally collides with what happened in that room, on the morning I woke up confused. Trevor, too, carries his burdens. I see in his gestures the difficulty of opening up, the desire to flee when the conversation threatens to touch on what was never said. The isolation of both of us is like a prison. two prisoners trying to find space to breathe. The secret of that morning still weighs on us. Unprecedented, unspeakable. Sometimes we look at each other by chance, and a brief smile escapes, shy, crooked, almost an apology for the past and the present. But neither of us has the courage to cross that space. The world outside goes on. But in here, any closeness is dangerous. And, paradoxically, irresistible. The past doesn't protect us from the present. Every minute the tension grows, as if everything depends on the next gesture, the next word. Desire, guilt, anger, fear. These feelings haunt every room in the house, every silence in the workshop, every restless night's sleep. Trevor remains, Carolyn ignores, and I, cornered by everything I never said, hope that fate will force me to decide what really matters. Sometimes, my days drag on, as if the heat of the late afternoon could bend time, distorting the hours into one endless moment. It was one of those late afternoons that almost challenged me to change my routine. That week, Trevor became more introspective. He changed channels on the TV nonstop, lost focus on his food, and in the workshop, his fingers always needed to find something to do. Despite the few words, I began to see signs in my son of the same desire for closeness that consumed me. The silence was no longer comfortable. It was heavy. Early in the evening, when Carolyn went out for a long walk, a habit she had adopted to clear her mind, Trevor and I were alone in the house for the first time with no interruption in sight. The sun was already disappearing behind the trees, casting orange shadows through the kitchen and the old hallway. I sat down to dinner in my usual spot, and Trevor grabbed 2 beers, opened one of them, and placed it in front of me without saying a word. The sound of the bottle opener mixed with the faint hum of the refrigerator, creating an absurd soundtrack for the discomfort. There, at that square table, step by step, we stared at each other. His eyes avoided fixing on mine. Then, without warning, he asked if I still remembered his first days of school. I didn't answer right away. I looked at the beer, twirled the glass between my fingers, trying to reach a good memory, far from the man who now sat in front of me. I remember you being nervous, the way you bit your lip. Trevor laughed softly, a husky, trapped sound. I never knew if you were proud of me, Dad. I was seized by a strange tension. The air seemed heavy. With every sentence, with every silence, a barrier was torn down, and something new emerged between the two of us. It was no longer just the affection of a son and father. It was the recognition of 2 unhinged souls. The atmosphere inside the house changed. A gentle warmth took over the room, as if the air were thick, difficult to breathe. I felt like touching Trevor's shoulder, an urgent need to fill the emptiness between us. But I hesitated, held back by the invisible wall of fear. I continued to pretend to be natural. Trevor crossed his arms, leaned back in his chair, and with a sudden gesture, made space with his feet as if to say, "Come, sit closer." I noticed then the smell of his lotion mixed with the grease from the workshop. A familiar and intimate smell that was not strange to me, but that I also could not accept. The kitchen, once a setting for routine, became the stage for a kind of silent ritual. The contact of our arms, the brushing of our legs under the table, everything was loaded with intention. The clock already marked late night, and the desire to prolong the moment, not to ruin it with fear or the wrong words, overcame me. Every shy laugh, every exchange of looks for longer than would be natural, created a dense atmosphere. It was as if we were about to cross an internal border that, until then, seemed untouchable and frightening. In the apartment, muffled by the yellow light of the kitchen, I felt emotions transforming. Memories of the past gave way to a new restlessness. The desire to be understood, to be accepted by Trevor. Even in this strange combination of proximity and confusion, the world seemed distant. Only the two of us existed in that space, savoring the discomfort and the desire, so mixed that they were no longer distinguishable. We exchanged short words, looks that asked for explanations and didn't receive them. What separated us at that moment was less morality than fear, of making a mistake, of losing, of trying and failing. The low lights created shadows on the walls, and we fell into a silence that was not empty. It was a promise. There was no threat of a storm, and the noise from the street was not able to break the unprecedented atmosphere between us. Trevor got up to get dessert, and when he came back, his face was less tense, more open. I sat next to him, the proximity clear, the heat increasing. That night, there was no need to talk, just to exist, just to feel. The small daily gestures, a clean plate, the served glass, the touch of our shoulders, became physical and emotional connections. In my thoughts, everything was confusion and curiosity. My heart was racing, as if the expectation was able to swallow any memory. I watched Trevor. He watched me. And for some reason, both of us seemed to know that a line was about to be crossed. Deep down, the desire to belong, to be understood at that moment, was stronger than any rule built over the years. The heat of the house, the smell that was a mixture of family, workshop, and young skin, made me lose track of time. Every sound was an echo, every touch, a provocation. I knew the night would be different, even without knowing exactly how. The desire, hidden under the layers of living together, was about to reveal itself. The page turned when dessert was over. Trevor collected the plates, came back close, sat next to me on the sofa. The very low volume of the television was just a pretext for us not to be in absolute silence. The minutes dragged on, and this time, there was no more fear of closeness. I felt his knee touch mine, slowly, like someone asking permission without asking. I looked at him. I didn't run away. For a while, we let the small space between us grow, be filled with what had no name until then. The contained flirtation, the expectation shaping gestures and words. My gaze stumbled on Trevor's hands, so similar to mine, calloused, but youthful. I watched how he breathed, how his chest rose and fell slowly. His hair was disheveled, his face flushed by the light of the TV. The desire was mutual. It was there, pulsing between our bodies. Each movement was a response to the other, without haste, without urgency, just the certainty that something special was happening. He moved even closer, until our legs touched completely. The skin contact was firm and at the same time soft, like a first attempt to recognize oneself in another body. I felt the heat rise from the floor, from the furniture, from the air itself. My chest was beating fast. For the first time since Carolyn had moved away, someone seemed to really see me. The atmosphere was pure magnetism, enveloping, impossible to resist. Trevor turned his face, looked at me in a new way. It wasn't just a search for approval, but for affinity, for belonging. He touched my hand, slowly. His touch was an invitation to cross the border of fear. Years of distance disappeared in that instant. The silence was finally broken, not by words, but by gestures. My fingers found his and intertwined. I feel the warmth, the restlessness, as if we were connected by invisible sparks. There, on that cramped sofa, everything happened without haste. My arm rested on Trevor's shoulder, and he leaned in more, resting his head on my chest. I felt his body relax, his breathing still nervous. The touch of his hair on my chin, the fresh smell mixed with the sweat of youth, made me remember what affection was. The desire to be perceived beyond the function of a father, beyond the worn-out family mechanism. Time seemed to no longer exist. The house was only ours. And finally, we allowed our will to speak louder than our fear. Gradually, our gestures became more and more intimate. There were no words, only the initiation and continuity of something that had been stored for a long time. The contact of our bodies, our hands sliding across our chests, our eyes meeting with urgency and comfort, created an atmosphere of discovery. Trevor's warmth flowed to me, like a torrent, and every inch touched was a confirmation of what we both felt. Vulnerability, a genuine desire for closeness. I ran my fingers over his arm, feeling the texture of his firm, young skin, like someone investigating the unknown and at the same time finding shelter. His face flushed, but he didn't avoid the contact. We exchanged small caresses, like two explorers on virgin territory. A shy touch on the neck, the brushing of lips on the cheek, the tight hug that precedes something bigger. Each act was a password. Our breathing became heavier, paced like a slow song. The desire was no longer just physical, it was also psychological, emotional, the longing for belonging that we both sought without admitting it. The contact intensified. His hands sought my face, tracing scars and expression lines, like someone deciphering an old story. When our eyes met again, we both knew that nothing would ever be the same. My body was dominated by unknown sensations. Each touch was as if a lamp was lit deep inside me. Trevor let his fingers trace trails across my chest, exploring the border of affection, of repressed desire. The heat spread to every place where our skin met. It was like navigating through seas never before traveled, each wave revealing a surprise, a shared secret. Trevor snuggled in more. Our tight hugs were silent confessions. The dilated time amplified every second, and in that instant, there was nothing else besides the desire to be there, present, whole. The intimate act presented itself as a primitive dance, not physical, but emotional. The contact of our mouths, the embrace of our bodies, the sliding of our fingers down our spines, everything was discovery. Everything was a challenge. Sweat dripped, our hearts beat in unison. Each gesture was an expression of desire, and also of fear. We knew that something irreversible was happening. At the height of the moment, the barriers fell. My body was pressed against Trevor's, our eyes meeting, our breathing heavy and urgent, as if we were both seeking redemption and belonging in that instant. The bed was no longer a symbol of routine. It was a territory of vulnerability. The rumpled sheets held whispers and unspoken confessions. Each touch was a promise, each hug a fulfillment of an old desire. We were, little by little, discovering each other, as if we were unraveling the most intimate secret of our own existence. My chest was swept away by unknown sensations. Trevor, looking at me with eyes that saw beyond the role of a son, saw there someone who also needed to be accepted. Every second was a revelation, every caress a response to the silence that had separated us for years. The tiredness, after everything, was more emotional than physical. My body felt heavy, my mind racing, stuck on what had been experienced, on what had been revealed. We stayed there, side by side, breathing, trying to understand what had just happened. We knew it wasn't just desire, it was also admitted neediness, exposed fear, a genuine desire to be understood. The bed was now a witness to everything, a secret in flesh and blood, impossible to undo. When we separated, the impression was that we had left a part of ourselves in each other. The final hug had the taste of goodbye, but also of hope. Silent, we returned to contemplating the ceiling, each lost in our own thoughts, trying to assimilate what we had just lived. Those minutes between the peak of the encounter and the return to silence were marked by a painful clarity. The feeling was of crossing a dark tunnel and emerging in another place, where everything was different, strange, and devastatingly real. I felt my body taken over by a heated tiredness, not from manual labor, but from everything that had been felt there, in that cramped space between the sheets. I avoided looking at Trevor in the first few minutes, afraid of facing everything that it meant. The present had been rewritten. There was no going back to what we were before. My son remained silent, rolling over, breathing heavily. Shame fought with desire, fear with hope. I confess that at some point, I considered running away, going out to breathe, but I stayed, trapped by the strength of the shared secret. The atmosphere between us was new. We had brought to the surface emotions that had long been dormant, impulses repressed for decades. I felt, with painful precision, the emptiness being filled by something so intense that it was almost uncomfortable. After all, that was the total breakdown of the role that had served as my shield, not only of a father, but also of a man and a husband. Realizing that Trevor sought refuge, acceptance, and understanding in me was like receiving a forbidden gift, an invitation to be who I really am, without masks. Silence became a weight. The words, when they finally came out awkwardly. "Dad, Trevor began, but gave up before finishing. I felt like apologizing, like justifying my own desire, like promising that it would never happen again. But there was no way to erase what had been lived. Instead, we stayed close, like people who accept guilt, feeling the need to process everything in that context of secrecy and discovery. In the house, the atmosphere transformed. Carolyn came back later, entered the room and didn't even notice the change. Trevor and I, now carrying the recent memory, were dealing with the new space between us, full of questions, empty of answers. The next day's activities were marked by a wavering accessibility, small gestures of closeness, long periods of introspection. My gaze at Trevor became an investigation. I looked for signs of regret, of joy or of flight in him, but all I saw was a tense mixture of surprise and fear. He also avoided looking at me. Sometimes he would disappear down the street. Other times he would go back to the workshop. The secret throbbed in every corner, like an indirect light that strengthens and also frightens. In the end, we were no longer just father and son. There was a new, tortuous relationship there, made of pieces of desire, moments of guilt, and a genuine desire to get closer. The memory of that act began to populate my days, with every look, with every silence. It was no longer possible to ignore the open wound, but I also didn't want to lose the feeling of belonging, of finally having been seen, accepted. Entering that intimacy was like gaining and losing everything at the same time. Internally, I was forced to face the consequences. The act transformed our family dynamic. We were now accomplices to a secret too heavy to be shared with the world. I began to review my concepts of love, desire, and loneliness. The emptiness that Carolyn caused no longer defined me completely. There was something new in me, complex, difficult to name. The emotional impact of that encounter reverberated within me. I felt more vulnerable than I had ever felt in my life. Trevor became more than a son. He became a mirror, a confessor, a refuge. The fear of being discovered grew, but it didn't overcome the feeling of rebirth. With every stumble of mine on the following mornings, with every silence at dinner, a part of me tried to absorb what this secret meant. Even so, I needed to withdraw. I had long periods of introspection, sitting on the sofa, between the light filtered by the curtains and the dust dancing in the air. I faced the difficult questions. What are we now? How far does the guilt go? Can I still be a father, a husband, a man, after what happened? I saw the same enigmas in Trevor. I realized that we were both sailing on a sea of uncertainties. The secret weighed on our shoulders, but it also offered a new opportunity, the chance to rebuild ourselves, to understand ourselves in all the depths and fences that had always separated us. At the end of that cycle, I knew that the world would not go back to normal. The intimate act left deep marks. But, unexpectedly, it also opened a crack for hope, of being seen, of being accepted, of discovering that there is much more inside us than we allow ourselves to know. And faced with these suspended answers, I began to recognize what was, finally, the greater meaning of desire: to be human, whole, and vulnerable. Trevor stayed for a few more days. The house seemed smaller, heavier, almost suffocating. The secret crossed everything. The silence in the hallways, the quick looks during lunch, the sound of footsteps echoing through the workshop. I would wake up early, trying to get back to my routine, the ritual of the weak coffee served before the sun rose, the tools lined up on the workbench like soldiers on standby. But I could no longer drink in the same way, or hammer with the same firmness as before. The weight of what we had lived through together made everything different. Even my breathing seemed different. During this time, Trevor occupied the corners of the house like someone avoiding seeing his own reflection. During the day, he would hide in the yard, clean the truck, work in the garden, always with repeated, distracted gestures, trying perhaps to silence the inner turmoil. At night, he would sit on the porch, looking at the stars, a half-extinguished cigarette, his face lost behind the smoke. We didn't talk about that night. We didn't name what secretly united us. The fear was of finding in words the definitive weight of guilt, of the break, of what could not return. Carolyn became even more of a ghost. She would come and go without ever noticing the cracks in our gestures, the cuts in our voices. Sometimes she would cross the living room, ask about a tool, about a late bill, without seeing the shadow of the secret that was growing there. In her presence, Trevor adopted a rigid, almost military posture, and I went into the automatic mode of bold answers and smiles, pretending that normalcy was possible. But as soon as she left, we would feel, almost physically, the air being released from the weight, even if only for a few minutes. Every goodbye is a small death, but knowing that it would come, and that it was necessary, hurt in a different way. One night, after dinner, Trevor asked his mother for the baked rice he loved as a child. It was a simple request, but there, between forkfuls and silence, he announced, "I think it's time to hit the road again." Carolyn, reserved, just said that he should take care of himself. I felt the ground shake. I looked at his face, looking for signs of decision, regret, maybe fear. He didn't look away, he held firm, but I saw deep inside him the same whirlwind that lived inside me. The next afternoon, the house was in absolute silence. Trevor threw a few clothes into the old backpack, grabbed the truck key, walked around the workshop without saying if he would be back soon, or if he was leaving forever. I waited at the door, giving timid signs of affection. When he came to say goodbye, his gesture was restrained. A firm hug, his big hands squeezing my shoulders like someone asking for forgiveness, with a wordless gesture. "Take care of yourself, Dad," he said, his voice husky, almost disappearing into the heavy air of the room. What was left between us was an impossible mixture to define: respect for the courage to have crossed this river, shame for what we had caused, and hope, yes hope, that life could offer us some possible path to redemption. The pain of goodbye wrapped around the relief. Not having to face, for now, questions, justifications, explanations. All that was left was memory. Raw, undefined, etched in every smell, in every corner of the house. Trevor left slowly, crossing the gate like someone saying goodbye not only to home, but to everything that was once called family. After he left, I went back to the workshop, sat next to the old radio, and let my thoughts wander through the past. The last night we were together was a living, pulsing memory, impossible to bury. I tried to work, but my hands were clumsy, distracted. My eyes darted from the tools to the walls, from the dismantled cars to the window. There was no escape. The secret was now a part of me, seeped into every cell. Carolyn maintained her routine without noticing the cracks. I was her husband, but there was no longer any common ground where we could walk together. She knew, in some way, that something had changed, but she didn't ask, perhaps for fear of abandoning the last illusion of normalcy. The loneliness seemed greater, deeper, because now it brought with it the taste of everything that had been allowed and lost. In the following weeks, each day was an exercise in resistance. There were moments when I wondered if Trevor would come back, if one day we would find words to name everything that separated and united us. I started to look at myself as a broken man, but also as someone who had been seen, understood, genuinely desired. The old emptiness was no longer the same. It had been transformed by that unique, open, and painful night. The secret became part of daily life, like the dust that seeps into every corner of the workshop. Sometimes, I would catch myself smiling when I thought of Trevor's gaze, the touch, the surrender. Other times, guilt would devour any attempt at joy. I understood that the goodbye was not only physical, it was also emotional, existential. Trevor carried a piece of me with him, of what I was with him, of what I allowed myself to be. I missed him, his presence, our interrupted conversations, his awkward way of asking for help. But I also felt relieved. I knew it was not possible to sustain that relationship, that secret, indefinitely. All that was left was silence. And within the silence, a search for understanding, for a new identity. Now, alone with my thoughts, I needed to revisit everything, from the first strangeness to the breaking of the last limit. I sat in front of the workshop, my hands on my thighs, and looked at the dark sky. I wondered if every man, someday, faces something like this. The deconstruction of roles, the need to break with the sacred family and accept the risk of no longer being recognized as before. Guilt was a heavy cloak, but there was also courage, for having allowed myself to be vulnerable, for having admitted that desire does not respect logic or custom. It just pulses where it is necessary. The emptiness I knew became a new landscape, painful, but true. In the place of the dead routine, space arose to discover who I was without the ties, without the fear of disappointing my wife, my son, myself. In the silence of the following days, I started to write a diary. In it, I tried to organize my thoughts, to understand where so many unspoken feelings came from. I discovered that the desire to be seen runs through everything. The workshop, the kitchen, the bedroom, the lost looks inside the old house. For the first time, I looked at the mirror with honesty. I saw there the common man, mechanic, father, husband, but also the extraordinary man, capable of action, courage, and love, even in forbidden territories. I allowed myself to cry, alone, among the toolboxes and old photos. I cried for Trevor, for Carolyn, for myself. I cried for the decades wasted behind walls of silence, for the trembling gestures, for the swallowed words. The secret made me human again, and there was no way to return to the previous state without accepting every piece of what I had lived. The passage of time brought with it a kind of acceptance. I learned to live with the memories, with the guilt, and with the possibility of hope. Trevor would send short messages. "Dad, everything okay there?" I would reply, always with simple sentences. They weren't declarations of affection, but they contained a new truth, respect, longing, a desire to start over in a different way. The house continued to be a territory divided between routine, pain, and memory. Carolyn never knew about the secret. She continued in her world, keeping the facade of what was left of us intact. I faced each new day as a chance for reconstruction, even if it was slowly, piece by piece, word by word. In the end, I understood that being seen is vital. Being accepted is even more so, and that moral limits are borders always in negotiation between desire and guilt. I confess that I am not resolved. I don't know if I ever will be. but I am able to look back and recognize the meaning of what I lived, the courage to break barriers, the strength that is born when the soul decides to reveal itself. I learned, with Trevor, that belonging is what saves, even in the most uncertain terrains. Today, I look at the workshop with a different perspective. Instead of being just a place of refuge, it is a symbol of what I was able to allow inside myself. The old radio still hisses, the tools shine under the pale sun, but I am different. In my encounters with Trevor, whether by message or by memory, I try to cultivate a less heavy, more open version of myself to what may still come. If you have followed my story this far, I leave you with a thought. We all have secrets that can change our world, and often what we lack is the courage to face the consequences of what we really want. If you have ever felt the desire to be seen, accepted, understood without the masks of daily life, perhaps you will understand what I lived. And I guarantee, there are no easy answers, but there is always a chance to find some piece of redemption where you least expect it. Please subscribe to the channel and leave a like to get access to more stories like this. What you're hearing here is just the beginning. The complete unfiltered stories with all the details you can imagine are available now. Check out the link in the description right now.